I'm going to teach you an orchestration technique to get a bigger, fuller, and richer sound from the orchestra. We'll listen to examples from film and classical scores, and then I'll show you how to actually use the technique in your own writing. Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Ryan and I write music for film, TV, and video games. Today I'm going to talk about orchestral resonance, which is when you put sustaining parts directly behind moving lines to give them more body and fill up more space. It's kind of like using the orchestra to mimic the sustain pedal on a piano. But because we don't actually have that pedal to just let notes ring out, we have to intentionally write those resonant parts in. In Rey's theme from Force Awakens by John Williams, we have this very active, rhythmic accompaniment part in the strings, harp, and trumpet. Behind that part, we have these long, sustained chords in the trombones. And if we look at the register, meaning how high or low in pitch the chords are, we can see that they sit exactly behind those moving parts. The active lines are sitting on top of and in the foreground of the trombones. They're in the same pitch register, which we're often discouraged against doing in orchestration. But here, instead of the different parts kind of fighting for that register and trying to be heard, the trombones are in the background, adding body and substance to those moving parts. I think this really shows that you don't always have to look in the vertical space for a gap to fill in your chord tones. In fact, here John Williams is doing the very opposite and intentionally putting those sustained chords in the same register where he put his accompaniment parts. In this excerpt from Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade, we have this wide arpeggio in the cellos outlining the harmony. And then directly behind that cello part, we have a clarinet and two bassoons sustaining the exact same pitches. So listen to the low winds and the cellos together. Now, as you listen to the whole orchestra, notice how those winds give it body and fullness, but you can still hear that cello line cut through. So it's a really powerful technique, but it's also fairly easy to use. Let's say you have this piano part and you want to orchestrate it. First, we'll choose a lead instrument. It's fairly high and sweet, so how about we go with flute? Next, we need to decide what instruments to use for the accompaniment. Something I've found to be a bit counterintuitive is that it can actually sound really good to have your accompaniment parts come from the same orchestral family as your main line. You don't always have to reach for opposite timbres. So in this case, because we have a woodwind in that lead melody, we could also have woodwinds on those accompanying arpeggios. Here, I think clarinet and bassoon would work nicely. Now comes the resonance. Because we have woodwinds on the moving parts, I'm going to go with a contrasting timbre for the resonance and put those sustains in the strings. So here I'll use the exact same pitches as the bassoon and clarinet, but put them on sustaining chords. Also, to keep the sound fairly light and gentle, I'll put those strings in divisi, and for a little accent on the downbeats, I think we could use pizzicato in the double bass. So back to that idea of having similar timbres in your melody and accompaniment, we could actually flip this and make the main sound on strings and the resonance in the woodwinds. And remember, in this example, I'm only using notes that were already given to us in the piano part. So first, let's hear just those woodwind chords. And now the strings on their own. Now, when we listen to it all together, again, feel how those winds add body and fullness and richness, but you're not actually adding any new musical material. There's a great book by George Frederick Mackay called Creative Orchestration. In the book, he outlines 8 distinct orchestral textures, and in the spring, I made a video about each one. So if you want to learn about those 8 orchestral textures, check out the intro video here. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.